Thanks so much, Jeff, for the very warm introduction. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here with all of you today, to have a chance to talk to this interdisciplinary group of scientists, philosophers on what I view as some of the most important challenges facing our society today. So I want to start to motivate this talk by speaking about the American dream, which is, of course, a multifaceted concept that has different meanings to different people. But as an economist, I want to distill it to what I view as one critical aspect of the American dream, something that drew my own parents to come to this country, the idea that America at least aspires to be a place where, through hard work, any child has the chance to move up in the income distribution relative to their parents, to achieve a higher standard of living. And so in a paper my colleagues and I wrote a few years ago, we set about to assess the extent to which America actually lives up to that aspiration by measuring the fraction of children who go on to earn more than their parents did, measuring both kids' and parents' incomes in their mid-30s and adjusting for inflation. And we're plotting here how that fraction evolves by the year in which the child was born, starting on the far left with kids born in the middle of the last century, and then going all the way to the right to kids born in the middle of the 1980s who are turning 30 around now when we're measuring their incomes as adults. Now, there are a bunch of technical details here in the background which make it quite complicated to construct this series because you don't have historical longitudinal data that would directly allow you to compare kids' and parents' incomes. The paper at a technical level is about how you can develop statistical methods to solve those problems. I'm not going to dwell on that here. Let me just focus on what I think the punchline is, which you can see for yourself. Back in the middle of the last century, for kids born at that time, it was a virtual guarantee that you were going to achieve the American dream of moving up. 92% of kids, by our calculations, born in 1940, went on to earn more than their parents did. But if you look at what has happened over time, you can see that there's been a dramatic fading of the American dream, such that for children born in the 1980s, entering the labor market around now, it's essentially become a coin flip, a 50-50 shot as to whether you're going to do better than your parents. So this dramatic trend is, of course, of great interest to economists like myself because it reflects a fundamental change in the US economy that we would like to understand. But I would argue it's also a fundamental social and political interest because I think it's this very trend that underlies a lot of the frustration that people around the United States are expressing, that this is no longer a country where it's easy to get ahead. And I think that's reflected in things like political outcomes that we've seen in recent years. So motivated by this trend, what I'm going to talk about in this presentation is recent work that essentially tries to understand what it is that's driving the fading of the American dream, and more broadly, what are the determinants of economic opportunity that is children's chances of rising up in the income distribution. Now, that's by no means, our team and the research that I'm going to discuss here is by no means the first to think about these issues of inequality and opportunity from an empirical perspective. These are topics that economists, sociologists, and others have thought about for decades. What is new, perhaps, is the use of, as Jeff put it nicely in his introduction, the use of big data or large-scale administrative data to study these issues with what I hope to show you in the next hour, an unprecedented granularity and precision that simply wasn't feasible before, where traditionally, you'd have the kind of time series evidence that I just started out with. You might wonder, what changed over the last 60 years. We can all come up with 10 different things that have changed in that time, and it's going to be very difficult to tell what exactly is central. Using large-scale administrative data, we can disaggregate across subgroups and use various quasi-experimental methods to uncover mechanisms and understand what's happening at a much finer level. Now, what I'm going to discuss here is going to be based on a series of papers that I've co-authored with several collaborators, John Friedman, Nathan Hendren, Matt Jackson, Larry Katz, Johanna Strobel, and many, many others who I'll cite along the way. And I'll mention the specific papers for those who are interested in further details on each of these studies. I'm going to give kind of a general overview here. I want to make one final note, recognizing that this is not an audience of economists. Economists naturally tend to focus on money as the metric of interest, and I kind of started out with that and just took that as given. You might wonder, is that, from a philosophical perspective, from other perspectives, the key thing that we should even be interested in, earning more than your parents or moving up in the income distribution? Of course, that's a debate one can have. and I'd be happy to discuss further when we get to questions, whether there are other metrics we should be focusing on. One thing I'll note is in other work we've done, which I won't discuss here today, we find that income is incredibly strongly correlated with a number of other outcomes that you might care about. For instance, health. So in other work, we've shown that there's an incredibly tight link between life expectancy and income, where the richest Americans live about 15 years longer than the poorest Americans. So there are a spectrum of outcomes from education to health to income that I think move together fairly tightly, and particularly at the bottom of the income distribution where I'm focused, you're often talking about living in poverty versus living in the middle class, having a reasonably healthy life, and my view is those seem like things many of us would be interested in supporting, regardless of whether you see money as kind of the end-all and be-all. Okay, so here's how I'm going to organize the lecture. I'm first going to talk about disaggregating the data, which I'll describe in a second, geographically, looking at different parts of the US, looking at different neighborhoods, which turns out to be very useful in understanding economic opportunity. I'll then spend some time dealing with what is a fundamental issue in the social sciences, understanding how much of the variation we see across areas is due to the causal effects of places versus selection or sorting, different types of people living in different places. That's going to be central for kind of figuring out how you want to proceed in analyzing the data. I'll show you, hopefully convince you, that the causal effect explanation seems quite important in understanding the variation we're seeing geographically. And then I'll turn to analyze what the determinants are of why some places in America seem to produce more economic opportunity than others. And I'll focus in particular on the most recent work we've done on our team, which is using large-scale social network data from Facebook to understand the role of social capital and social connections in economic opportunity, which it turns out, I think, to be quite central. And then finally, I'll spend some time talking about policies to increase upward mobility in light of these research findings to show you how this type of work is not just of academic interest, but actually is changing things in terms of policies, changing people's lives on the ground. So with that, let me start by just telling you at a very brief level what the core data that I'll be using to analyze and present these results. So one of the core data sets we use to measure intergenerational mobility is census data covering the entire US population, which you're all familiar with from various statistics that you see on a regular basis. Importantly here, linked to federal income tax returns covering everyone in this room and everyone else in America from 1989 to 2015. So what does that allow you to do? The census data are cross-sections, snapshots at a particular point in time. Fundamentally, in order to study intergenerational mobility or the dynamics of income inequality, you want longitudinal data. You want to be able to follow people over time, and you want to be able to follow people across generations. That has traditionally been very difficult in the social sciences. Any survey-based method, it's very hard to track people over time as they move to different areas, as they have kids, and so on. And that's fundamentally limited our ability to study these things on a large scale. By linking the census data to the tax data, you now have a population-level panel of every person in America, and no matter where they move, you can link them to their kids, and so on, which is going to enable all the work that I'll show you. So we're going to take that data set, and for the main analysis I'm going to show you, focus on essentially all kids who were born in the US between 1978 and 1983, so it's about 20 million kids who grew up in the United States. We're going to measure both parents and kids' incomes, just to be clear, in pre-tax dollars. Everything I'm going to discuss is on a pre-tax earnings basis at the household level rather than the individual level. Okay, so with that background of the data, let me turn to show you the first analysis, which is the disaggregation of the national picture of economic mobility that I started out with from a geographic perspective. So let me first describe how we construct this map and then tell you what I think we learned from it. So what we do here is take those 20 million kids, map them back to where they grew up in the US, dividing the US into 740 different metro and rural areas. In each of those areas, we calculate a very simple measure of upward mobility. We ask, what is the average household income at age 35 for kids who grew up in low-income families, that is, families earning $27,000 a year, which puts you at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution. So basically, we're going to take those set of kids who grow up in those low-income families in each of these places, follow them over time using the tax records, no matter where they live as adults, measure their incomes, and map them back to the place where they grew up, okay? So what the map is plotting is just the average incomes of kids who grew up in each of these places in low-income families, colored so that blue-green colors represent areas with higher levels of upward mobility, and red-orange colors represent areas with lower levels of upward mobility. So if you start by just looking at the scale in the lower right-hand side of this chart, you can see that there's an incredible spectrum in terms of kids' chances of moving up, even in the present day in the US. There are some places, like in the center of the country, like Dubuque, Iowa, for example, where kids born to low-income families have a substantial amount of upward mobility across one generation. If you grow up in Dubuque, on average, you'll be earning $45,000, according to the tax data, one generation later, significantly more than the $27,000 income that these kids started out at, where their parents started out. But in contrast, if you look, for instance, at a place like Charlotte, North Carolina, or much of the Southeast, New Orleans, you see that kids who start out in families at exactly the same income level are ending up in a dramatically different place on average. So look at Charlotte with average incomes of $26,300, despite the tremendous amount of growth that's occurred in the US over the past 30 years, and Charlotte in particular, kids there are on average actually doing worse than their parents were a generation ago. So the first simple fact here is if somebody asks you, is the American dream alive? Is the US a land of opportunity today? The answer is that it really depends upon which part of America you're talking about. And so that is in and of itself useful to know from a scientific perspective, because it suggests that if we're thinking about how to revive the American dream, we might want to focus on different places, different parts of the US, understand what we can do in the red-colored places in particular to improve opportunity there. But second, and I think in some ways more importantly for social scientists and academics, this type of variation gives us an unprecedented lens into studying the determinants of economic opportunity that we've never had before. It's sort of like having a microscope to be able to zoom in, right, and look at these things in a much finer way, where you can start to ask, what is it that's different about Dubuque or Salt Lake City relative to Atlanta or Charlotte, or one neighborhood of a city relative to another neighborhood of a city, which can then help us understand the science of economic opportunity, as Jeff put it, and potentially make changes down the road based on that type of analysis. So motivated by that line of reasoning, the way I'm going to structure the discussion in the next few minutes here is to basically walk through a set of hypotheses for what might be driving the variation we're seeing in this map and systematically evaluate those hypotheses. You already might have some hypotheses in your own mind for what's going on here. And so I'm just going to take intuitive explanations that you might think of based on prior theories, other types of reasoning, and so on. So first, starting with an explanation that economists often think of, maybe this is about differences in the types of labor markets across areas. The types of jobs that are available in Silicon Valley are very different from the types of jobs that are available in the Midwest or in Charlotte, et cetera. So is it that when you're living in a place like with a booming tech sector, is that what's helping people rise up in that place? So to assess that, let's turn to this scatter plot here, which plots the data on upward mobility that I was showing you from the map just a second ago for the 30 largest metro areas in the US against measures of job growth from 1990 to 2010, the period over which the kids in this sample were growing up. And what you can see here is that there's basically no relationship between these two variables. In particular, you have places like Charlotte and Atlanta, which are some of the most rapidly growing cities in America. So by any conventional repeated cross-section measure, or if you were just driving around the city, you would see that Charlotte today looks dramatically different than it did 30 years ago. It looks like a much richer city with many more high-paying jobs and so on. But what you can see with this longitudinal data is that that growth does not directly translate to better outcomes for the kids growing up in low-income families in Charlotte. So you might wonder first, just from an arithmetic perspective, how is it possible that when you look at repeated cross-sections, snapshots, Charlotte looks like it's getting much richer over time, but the people who are growing up in Charlotte are not actually having higher incomes. How does that add up? So the way I think about it is that Charlotte and Atlanta basically import talent. Lots of people move to those cities to get high-paying jobs at places like Bank of America, which is headquartered in Charlotte. But apparently what you see in these longitudinal data now that we have them is that that doesn't directly translate into better outcomes necessarily for the kids growing up in low-income families in Charlotte. In particular, they are not getting those jobs at Bank of America. And so the first, very simple point that emerges from this is that just trying to increase jobs in a given area, get the Amazon headquarters to move to your city is not in and of itself a recipe to improving economic opportunity. You actually have to think about how you equip people with the skills or develop human capital in order to be able to get these higher paying jobs. Okay, so that was potential explanation number one, that it's about differences in labor markets. That doesn't seem to be it in and of itself. Okay, so let's now come back to the big map here and consider a second explanation, this time coming from demography. Anyone familiar with the demography of the United States would recognize that there's a potential connection to race here. In particular, the places that are in the red and orange colors are the places with larger African American populations. We all know that there's a long history of racial disparities and discrimination in the United States. So you might wonder how much of the difference we're seeing in this map is about differences by race rather than differences by place. So to figure that out, what we did next is use the census data linked to the tax data, which allows us to get information on race and ethnicity for every American, and allows us to construct this pair of maps separately now for black men on the left and white men on the right. The exact same statistics I was showing you before, rates of upward mobility for kids growing up in low-income families, but now disaggregated by race. So when you first look at this slide, you might have the reaction that, it looks like they put these two maps on two different color scales, kind of a red-orange color scale on the left and a blue-green color scale on the right. But in fact, if you look at the bottom of the slide, you can see that we have not. The maps are on the same color scale. It's just that there is such an extreme difference in rates of upward mobility between black and white men in America that it's like you have two completely different sets of colors. It's like you're living in two separate countries, basically, right? To put it more precisely in statistical terms, the very best places in terms of upward mobility for black men, a place like Boston, for example, where a black man growing up in a low-income family can go on to expect to earn about $25,000 as an adult. They have lower levels of upward mobility than some of the very worst places for upward mobility for white men, a place like Charlotte, North Carolina, for example. So it's like you basically have two non-overlapping distributions, right? So what that shows us is that race is undoubtedly important in the US in the present day, even conditional on class, right? So remember, we are controlling in a very precise way using information from tax returns over many years to look at kids starting out at exactly the same income level. And what we see here is that your race still matters tremendously in determining your economic outcomes. So you'll notice that I subset the data here specifically to men. So why did I start to disaggregate the data by gender as well? So it turns out, if you now replicate the exact same pair of maps for women, you get a very different picture. So if you look at black women on the left and white women on the right, you now have basically the same spectrum of colors in the map on the left and the right, showing that rates of upward mobility, and more broadly a wide variety of outcomes we've looked at, once you control for parental income, there are really not significant differences between white women and black women. So racial disparities in America, this simple analysis shows, emerge from sharp differences in rates of mobility, but in particular among men. And so that might make you think about explanations related to things like interaction with the criminal justice system, or discrimination in the labor market that particularly affects men, and so on. Whatever the explanation is, I don't think we know for sure yet. It's very clear that there's an intersectionality with gender that's extremely important. Okay, so what we've seen so far is that race seems important in explaining, quite a bit of the variation. But even conditional on race, if you look at the map on the right for white women, for example, there's still a huge amount of variation across places, even conditional on race. So my take from studying these issues is that race is undoubtedly important, but place still matters. And so I want to go deeper now in understanding why it is that place actually matters. And so in order to do that, what we did next is zoomed in to think about neighborhoods not just at this level of one city versus another city or one part of the US versus another part of the US, which if you think about it intuitively, you want to think about your neighborhood, you would not think of it as the broad metro area. You probably think about it as your particular town, the particular school district you're in, things like that. And so in order to look at that, I'm just going to show you a snapshot here from what we're calling the Opportunity Atlas. This is one of the tools you can access from the Opportunity Insights website, or opportunityatlas.org. You can go to that website, and it basically works like a Google map. You can type in any address you want and zoom in to look at the same statistics I've been showing you on rates of economic mobility by race and so on, census tract by census tract across the US. So I'm showing you a snapshot here of that data for New York City. So every census tract in America has about 4,000 people. So this is a very fine breakdown of neighborhoods. And we're showing the same statistics that I was showing you earlier. Within each of these tracts, look at the set of kids who grew up there. Because you have the entire US population, you have enough precision to actually measure this pretty reliably. And so, we construct the same measures of upward mobility. So, some of you recognize the geography of New York, and you can see that there are very sharp differences with higher rates of upward mobility in Queens, for example, relative to parts of Brooklyn, and so on. The simple point I want to make here is that the spectrum of colors that you're seeing here in this New York area map is the same as what I was showing you in the national maps that we started out with. So what is that telling us? You can go 2 miles down the road in New York City, and it's like you're going from Alabama to Iowa in terms of rates of upward mobility. So what this is showing us is that the roots of these differences in economic opportunity are not about regional differences or state-level differences in policies. Apparently, a big part of the variation is coming from hyper-local differences often on different sides of the street, or one neighborhood right next to another neighborhood, which I think is useful in understanding what might be going on here. So you can analogously look at data for any other city in the US, any other part of the US, and you'll generally find very similar patterns in terms of this type of variation to what we're seeing in New York. Okay, so what I've established so far is that there's a lot of geographic variation in rates of upward mobility across places. What I want to do next is ask how much of this geographic variation that we're seeing in the maps that I've been showing you is driven by the causal effect of place. That is, if I take a given kid and put that kid in one of the green colored parts of the maps that I've been showing you, as opposed to the red colored parts, I would see different outcomes for that given kid. Versus sorting. That is, the types of people who are living in the red-colored parts of New York are just different in terms of their characteristics, maybe the amount they're investing in their kids, et cetera, their levels of education, from the types of folks living in the blue and green-colored parts. So that is an age-old question in the social sciences, trying to basically disentangle the effects of environment from nature or other forms of selection. People have been working on these issues for a very long time, and I would say that the literature has not been very conclusive in figuring out how important causal effects of environment, in particular neighborhood environment, are. So what I'm going to talk about here is some progress that's been made in the past 7 or 8 years or so, again using these large-scale data, that allow us to implement various quasi-experimental research designs that I think have led to a clear consensus in terms of why neighborhoods have a causal effect and what the magnitude of those causal effects are. And so in particular, I'm going to talk here about an analysis that exploits variation in the age of the child when families move from one place to another place in order to identify the causal effects of place. Now, instead of, again, going into the statistical details of the study where we look at 7 million families that move across different neighborhoods, I'm going to summarize what we find in the context of a simple example, going back to the data for New York City. So when you look at the data for New York, it turns out that there's a nice contrast you can see if you zoom into a part of New York called Brownsville, which is a pretty high poverty part of New York, some of you might be familiar with. And I want you to think about contrasting 2 adjacent parts of Brownsville. There's one part called the Van Dyke Houses, which is one of the largest public housing projects in New York City. And then there's another area which turns out to be just south of a street called Dumont Avenue, which is a place called the Nehemiah Houses, which is a mixed income housing development that a congregation developed in the 1980s. Okay, so if you look up the data, you go to the Opportunity Atlas website and type in these 2 names, you will see that kids who grow up from birth in the Van Dyke houses have average incomes in adulthood of about $17,000 a year, and kids who grow up from birth in the Nehemiah houses have substantially higher average incomes as adults. Okay, so what I want to do now is understand how much of that difference that we're seeing observationally in the data is due to the causal effect of growing up in the Nehemiah houses versus the Van Dyke houses. And so the way we're going to figure that out is by looking at a set of families who moved with their kids from the Van Dyke houses to the Nehemiah houses with kids of different ages, starting with families who move when their child is exactly 2 years old. Okay, so this first dot here, what we're doing is tracking forward about 30 years, the kids who made this move from the Van Dyke houses to the Nehemiah houses when they were exactly 2. And what we're seeing in that first dot is that those kids have average earnings in adulthood of $25,000 a year, okay? So that's for the kids who move when they're exactly 2. Now let's repeat that analysis for kids who move when they're 3, 4, 5, and so on. And what you see is a very clear declining pattern. The later you make that move from the Van Dyke houses to the Nehemiah houses, the less of a gain you get. And if you move after you're in your early 20s, the relationship becomes completely flat and you get no gain at all. So I've described this set of results in the context of this one particular pair of places. What we're actually doing in the background is looking at millions of families that are basically moving from more red-colored areas to more blue-green colored areas. And we're using that variation to estimate this curve, okay? So what do we learn from this analysis? So under the key identification assumption that the selection patterns in terms of which families are moving across these neighborhoods don't vary with the age of the child. So what we need for this to be interpreted as a causal effect is that the families who move when their kids are young, who make this move when their kids are young, are comparable to the families who move when their kids are older. You might wonder about the validity of that assumption, so a lot of the paper is about whether that assumption is right and how you might test it. Let me just give you one quick example of how you can evaluate that. You have enough precision here to compare siblings within the same family. So you can look at a family that moves with a 3-year-old and a 7-year-old from the Van Dyke houses to the Nehemiah houses, and remarkably, you get exactly the same curve back if you put in family fixed effects and only use sibling comparisons. So there are various things like that that one can do to try to build confidence in that assumption. I won't bore you with those details here, but just, our sense is that that is actually valid. And so if you take that assumption as given, what do you learn from this analysis? Well, first, you learn that neighborhoods really do seem to have a causal effect on kids' outcomes. Apparently, if you take a given kid and move that kid from one place to another, you can see a really meaningful change in their life outcomes. Second, you learn that what really seems to matter is childhood environment rather than where you live as an adult. We see this in this study and a number of other studies as well. And finally, you see that there appears to be a dosage effect, where every extra year that you spend in a better environment, the better you do in the long run. So this last point is extremely important, I think, in the context of current policy discussions about expanding early childhood education and early childhood interventions. Our sense is that it can be incredibly valuable to help kids move to a better environment and improve their environment when they're 2 or 3 years old, preschool programs, things like that. But what these data show you is if you move to a better environment when you're 10 instead of 15 or 15 instead of 20, that continues to have quite substantial impacts. It's not like the ship has sailed after you're 5 or something like that. So environment matters throughout childhood in this dose-dependent manner. So after we did this initial work, there have been now a dozen other studies doing a similar analysis of looking for dosage effects in other countries, using other research designs, using things like public housing demolitions that force people to move to different neighborhoods and create kind of an exogenous shock. And basically the bottom line is there's a pretty clear consensus in this field. I'm not going to summarize each of these, but you can see this very clear declining pattern in each of these with respect to age, where the earlier you move to a better environment in various settings, the better outcomes look in the long run. So I would say that now appears to be a consensus in the social sciences that this is how neighborhood effects operate. And this was missed in the prior literature because people really didn't have the data to track kids systematically over time and look at those very young kids where you had to wait 25 years to see the impacts of moving to a better neighborhood. Okay, so moving now to the third part of what I want to talk about. Probably a natural question in your mind at this point is, we've established that there's some parts of America, some parts of different countries around the world that produce much better outcomes than others. So what is it that they're actually doing differently? And what can we learn from that? So there's a literature that has also emerged over the past several years as our team has put out these kinds of data publicly in the US. Lots of people have taken that data and correlated it with a wide variety of factors that, across different fields, from education to sociology to political science, you might think might be important in determining economic opportunity. And so, one could give a seminar on each of these, and each of these are substantial papers investigating these issues. I'm just going to very quickly summarize some of the types of factors that people have identified as being very strong predictors of this variation in the maps that I've been showing you. So things like lower poverty rates, for example, neighborhoods that are more mixed income with lower rates of concentrated poverty tend to be places where kids from low-income families are more likely to rise up. As you might expect, places with better public schools, places with lower levels of income inequality in a given generation have more mobility across generations. There are links to racial segregation, family structure. Places with more two-parent families tend to have higher levels of upward mobility, and so on. One factor that over the years many people had mentioned to me as being potentially important, and I had wondered about myself based on various results we had seen, is the potential importance of social capital, which of course is a concept that's been widely discussed for more than 100 years across many social science fields, popularized in the general public by Bob Putnam, for example, in a series of books that you all will know. And so talking with Bob, talking with many others, I began to wonder, how important is social capital, in fact? And can we take, again, this big data sort of approach to measure social capital systematically, understand its determinants, understand how we might manipulate it going forward through interventions, and so on. And so I'm going to spend some time discussing that, both because I think empirically it turns out to be quite important, but also because this so happens to be the most recent work our team has done in a pair of papers we published in Nature a few weeks ago. So what are we doing here? So what we did when we started to think about social capital is I connected with Mark Zuckerberg, of Meta and Facebook, and started to think about how you could use large-scale social network data to measure these, measure social capital more precisely. And so what we ended up doing is starting a research collaboration with Facebook's core data science team, where we analyzed data on all US Facebook users between the ages of 25 and 44 as of May 28th, 2022. So basically take a snapshot of that Facebook data as it exists earlier this year. That comprises about 72 million people in America, who between them have 21 billion friendships on Facebook, and critically covers 84% of the US population. So anytime you use these data sets, you worry about how representative they are. With the Facebook data, at least starting from a decent place with 84% of the US population, we worry a lot about who the remaining 16% are, and again, won't bore you with the details, but our sense is that what you learn from this 84%, I think, is a pretty reliable indicator of what is likely to be going on in the US population as a whole. Okay, so when we started to work on these issues, the first thing we realized is if we wanted to measure social capital, we had to be precise on what it is we're actually trying to measure. So as a lot of you probably know, the term social capital has been used to mean many different things in different fields, even within sociology. People have different constructs of social capital. So the first thing we tried to do is go back to this voluminous prior literature and try to organize it into a set of measures of social capital that we could try to go after systematically in the Facebook data. And so we found it useful to organize the many different concepts into three categories. So the first is what I'm going to call measures of connectedness, shown in the diagram on the left there, where imagine you have people with different characteristics. So say low-income people and high-income people. We're basically going to look at the Facebook network graph and ask how connected these different types of people are. So to what extent are low-income people interacting with high-income people in a given community, in a given setting, et cetera. You could think about connectedness on many other dimensions as well, by age, by race, by language. So that's one general notion. It goes back to people like Pierre Bourdieu and sociology, Glenn Lowry in economics, and so on. There's another very different set of notions of social capital, which is really the focus of the network science literature or modern computer science literature, where people focus on what you might call measures of cohesiveness. The way to think about it, abstractly is let's take away the colors in the picture on the left. You just have a set of people. You don't attach labels to them. You don't have characteristics. And you just ask, what is the structure of the network graph itself? Is it fragmented into separate cliques where there's some people who are friends with each other in this room and other people are friends with other people? Or is it that everyone's friends with everyone here? And so you can construct various statistics to measure the extent to which you have a fragmented network versus one that's very cohesive. And then a third concept of social capital, which is really what Putnam was focused on in his early books like Bowling Alone, are ideas of civic engagement that have nothing to do with networks, but are about things like volunteering rates, how much people participate in their community and various civic organizations, and so on. Turns out the Facebook data are quite useful for measuring those as well, because you see the groups that people participate in, and you can get much more precise measures of things like volunteering rates and civic engagement than we've ever had before. And so we were able to construct those types of measures as well. So I'm going to focus here, in the interest of time in this talk, on one particular measure that we call economic connectedness, which is basically a measure of the degree of cross-class interaction that we see in the Facebook data. So how do we construct this measure? What we're doing here is for every county in America, we are taking the set of people who have below median income and asking what fraction of their friends on Facebook have above median income, above the national median. We're coloring this map so that blue-green colors are places with more cross-class interaction, where low-income folks have more high-income friends, and red colors are places with more disconnection across class lines. So you'll probably see immediately that this map looks incredibly similar to the first maps that I was showing you on economic mobility from the completely separate tax data. And so let's formalize that. Let's do a scatter plot, similar to what I showed you initially with the job growth rates, plotting upward mobility again on the y-axis, but this time against the economic connectedness measure. And here you can see there's an incredibly tight link between these two things. The places that are more economically connected, where low-income folks have more interaction with high-income people, tend to be places where kids in low-income families are more likely to rise up, all right? So one potential explanation for why we see this link is a causal one. It could be that when you have more such links, there are reasons you yourself are more likely to rise up, starting from the very simple idea of just networks mattering for things like job referrals and internships that you might not otherwise get. But I think actually probably more importantly, who you're interacting with might shape things like your aspirations, the information you have to do something like apply to college if you've never met anybody who's gone to college or thought about pursuing a career in science or medicine or whatever it might be, that just may not be on your radar screen. So there are many potential causal mechanisms you can think of that would generate this relationship. But there are also other correlational mechanisms that might have nothing to do with causality. So what's one example? You'll notice that the cities that are on the right here tend to be richer places. So why is that? You tend to be friends with the people who are around you. And we see this very clearly in the data, especially for lower income folks. A lot of their friends are physically proximate to them. So if you live in a richer place where you're more exposed to high income people, you're more likely to have high income friends. But that may make you wonder, is the reason that San Francisco has such a high level of economic connectedness and such a high level of upward mobility because of that type of interaction, or is it just because San Francisco is a pretty rich place? And so, we have property tax finance schools, maybe when you have more resources, you have better schools, you have better resources on various other dimensions, and maybe it's that set of factors that actually matters. So to show you how we can start to piece that apart, let me turn to this plot here, which I see as one of the central points of this first of two papers that we just put out on social capital. So to set this up, what we're doing first here is plotting the measures of economic connectedness, the share of high-income friends that low-income people have, with one dot for every zip code in America. We're going to go down to the zip code level now. plot that against the median household income in the zip code, just how rich are the people in your zip code. Okay? You see very clearly there's an upward sloping relationship here. That reflects exactly the intuition that I was just talking about. If you live around richer people as a low-income person, you tend to have more high-income friends. Okay, now we get to the key point. Let's now color these dots by the rates of upward mobility from the Opportunity Atlas tax data, where remember the red colors represent places where kids are less likely to rise out of poverty, and the blue-green colors represent places where the kids are, low-income kids are more likely to rise out of poverty. So what you see here, I think, is a very clear and striking pattern, which is that if you take any vertical slice of this figure, you see that the dots change in color as you move upwards systematically from red to blue. So what is that telling us? If I take a set of places, all of which have median household incomes of about $50,000 a year, so they have comparable resources, and I move from a place where there's more social disconnection across class lines to a place where there's more cross-class interaction, I see that rates of upward mobility systematically go up. So holding fixed levels of income, when there's more cross-class interaction, we see that that strongly predicts upward mobility. But if I do the converse exercise, if take any horizontal slice of this graph, you can see that if I move from a place that is relatively poor to a place that's much richer, but hold fixed the level of cross-class interaction, there's no change at all, actually, in kids' chances of rising up in the income distribution. So what that type of analysis shows you, and we do a number of other things along these lines, is that what really seems to be the critical predictive factor is the degree of cross-class interaction, rather than average incomes in an area or various other characteristics that you might think would be correlated with this measure. Okay, so given that finding, we then became interested in understanding, what is it that's leading some of these places to have a lot more cross-class interaction than others, despite having similar levels of income? And what might that teach us about how we can increase economic connectedness, social capital, and economic mobility going forward? So to get at that, first, it turns out to conceptually be useful to distinguish between two very different forces that can determine the level of economic connectedness. The first is what I'm going to call exposure, or just the amount of segregation by income in an area. So to take a simple example, imagine you have two schools, A and B, and all the rich kids go to one school and all the low-income kids go to the other school. So since you can't be friends with people you never meet, that is going to generate a society that's very disconnected across class lines. So one simple reason that we might have low levels of social connection in America across class lines is this type of lack of exposure or segregation. But there's another possibility, which is what we're calling friending bias. That is a lack of interaction, even conditional on exposure. So consider this example here, where you have two schools that are perfectly integrated by income, but you still don't have any cross-class friendships because all the rich kids hang out with each other and all the low-income kids hang out with each other, even though they're in the same school. So distinguishing between these two phenomena as potential sources of the economic disconnection we see, I think, is extremely important, because if it's about a lack of exposure, then the type of solutions we need to think about are things like changes in school boundaries, maybe affordable housing policies, busing, things that bring people together physically. If it's about friending bias, that might not actually be what you need to focus on. The issue might be within a given school, within a given neighborhood, why are you seeing this sort of separation? So what we can do with the Facebook data is figure that out, figure out which of these things is more important. And the way we do that is by taking each of those 21 million friendships that we see in the data, mapping them back to where the friendship emerged. So we can make a pretty good guess about whether Jeff and I became friends at this conference or in high school or in our church or wherever else. And so we're able to allocate friendships to the specific schools, the specific religious groups, the specific recreational groups that people belong to, and so on. And by doing that, we can then construct measures of both of these key axes that determine economic connectedness. The exposure measure, which is just the share of high-income people in a given unit. So in this case, I'm showing you the data by high school in America. All of this is now, by the way, publicly available. You can again download from the Opportunity Insights website. There's something called the Social Capital Atlas that we've set up. where you can go look up for your school, for your zip code, for your college, et cetera, what do these measures and various other measures look like. And so on the x-axis is something that you could have seen from other data as well, which is basically the socioeconomic composition of the school. On the y-axis is this measure of friending bias. How much are people interacting or not interacting with people from different class backgrounds, conditional on the set of people who are in their school. And so the simple point I want to make is there's just a lot of dispersion on both of these dimensions. So in particular, take a couple examples. Evanston Township High School is the big public high school near Northwestern University. It's a pretty diverse high school on the surface. It has a mix of low and high income kids. But when you look at the Facebook data, you can see that it is a school with a tremendous amount of friending bias, where the low income kids are basically not interacting with the high income kids at that school. And so, both of those dimensions matter quite a bit. So what you can do with these data is, once you have this level of disaggregation, you can understand not just the exposure dimension, but also the determinants of this friending bias dimension. What I want to emphasize is many people have the intuition, I think rightly so, that exposure is determined by policy choices. So the amount of segregation we have in our neighborhoods is determined by things like zoning laws, the way we set up schools, and so on. But friending bias, I think, is also importantly shaped by institutional and policy choices. And so just to give you a flavor for that, here's one example of a determinant that's quite important. If you look at the level of friending bias in schools versus the size of the school, you see that bigger schools systematically have higher levels of friending bias than smaller schools. So that's, I think, a phenomenon that's been documented in sociology in the past as well, that big groups tend to lead to separation. You tend to look for people who are sort of similar to you. In small groups, you see much more cross-class interaction. So one simple implication of that might be, in these very large public high schools, we might want to think about how you create smaller cohorts, or you think about a place like New York City, there's actually a big movement to create smaller schools, and that kind of thing could potentially have an impact. Another example, looking instead of just within schools, now looking across settings, across different types of places where friendships are made, we see systematic variation in the degree of friending bias across where people are meeting. So in particular, if you look on the far right, you can see that the friendships that are formed in religious groups are much more likely to cut across class lines than friendships formed in neighborhoods or in workplaces and so on. Even for a given person, the types of friends they're forming in these different settings look very different. And so that's another indication that this is malleable. It's not just that some people have a lot of friending bias and it's like totally independent of the structure of the environment. Okay, so putting together these statistics at the level of all of these different groups, we find that if you were to completely eliminate differences in exposure by socioeconomic status, you'd close about 50% of the gap in the share of high SES friends between low and high SES people. So that is to say, you'd eliminate about half of the social disconnection between low and high income people in America if you were to fix the segregation problem. That is, if you were to completely desegregate every high school, every college, every neighborhood, which obviously would be an enormously difficult undertaking. And so, what that highlights to me is that even if you were to manage to accomplish this perfect integration, you'd still have 50% of the social disconnection left, which highlights the importance of the friending bias phenomenon as something that we also need to think about tackling, which I think has received much less attention traditionally. So one thing you might be wondering about, and I think it's quite important from a political point of view, so maybe creating more interaction, having less friending bias, all of these things that I've been talking about are going to be helpful for low-income people, create higher levels of upward mobility, perhaps reduce inequality in the long run. But what about the impacts on high SES people? One of the reasons that people might not be interested in that kind of integration, that kind of social interaction, is a worry that their own kids perhaps might be adversely affected by this type of integration. My sense is, setting aside whether this is empirically true or not, in practice, that's actually a really important determinant of policies and equilibrium and can limit efforts to create that kind of integration. So we can ask empirically in these data, what is the relationship between the outcomes of kids from high-income families and the level of cross-class interaction look like? And how does that compare to the relationship that we've already established between the outcomes of kids growing up in low-income families and the level of cross-class interaction? And so the orange here is basically showing you what I showed you earlier for low-income kids, and you can see that clear upward sloping relationship. The more cross-class interaction you have, better low-income kids do. The green shows you that there's a much more shallow relationship for high-income kids. So we do see a negative correlation, but it's much shallower. And so I think one key challenge to think about going forward from a political point of view is if there is a little bit of this trade-off, but on net, it seems like from a social point of view, people would benefit from having more integration. How do you actually sustain that in equilibrium? That strikes me as a quite interesting question to figure out how to solve these problems going forward. So in that vein, in the last few minutes, it's okay if I take a couple more minutes here before wrapping up? Yes. I think we're just about up on time, but I just want to leave you with some thoughts on how all this is not just relevant kind of from the perspective of understanding what's going on, but actually can be useful for doing something about it. And so I want to spend a few minutes in conclusion here talking about various policy approaches to increase upward mobility that our team is focused on in light of the research findings that I've just shared with you. So in a nutshell, what I think we've learned from years of research by many scholars in this area is that the roots of economic opportunity are hyperlocal, they depend upon where you grow up in particular, and they relate to a variety of factors, including things like who you're interacting with. Okay, so if you have that view of the world, I think you would naturally think about 3 different ways to increase upward mobility. The first is to reduce segregation. If I know there's a place 2 miles down the road where low-income kids might do much better, what if I just help more kids move to such areas? The second, recognizing that you can't possibly move everyone, not everyone wants to move, is to bring opportunity to people where they currently live and make place-based investments in the red-colored parts of the maps that I've been showing you to improve economic opportunity there. And then the third is recognizing that after age 18, the key touch point for most kids is not the house in which they're growing up, but the institution of higher education that they're attending. I think there's a lot we can do in the higher education space as well. So we spend a few minutes touching on each of these and wrap up. So let's start with the reducing segregation approach, where I'm going to turn now to data from Seattle, show you another snapshot from the Opportunity Atlas data on rates of upward mobility, where you see that similar checkered pattern to what we saw in New York City. But what we've done here is overlaid in the bright green dots the most common census tracts where kids in families receiving housing vouchers from the federal government currently live. So you all might know, just a bit of institutional detail here, that we spend about $45 billion per year in the US on various affordable housing programs, the largest component of which are housing vouchers, which are basically rental assistance for low-income families worth about $1,500 a month in the Seattle area. So you might notice a puzzling pattern in this map, which is despite the fact that these families are receiving $1,500 a month from the government, they're still concentrated in the red and orange colored parts of Seattle, not the blue-green colored parts where we know from our prior work, you're actually going to end up breaking the cycle of poverty and giving people a chance to move up. So when we put out this data, various housing authorities and HUD approached us and began to wonder, why is this happening? Can we do something to make the program more effective? And so we designed a pilot study, a randomized trial in Seattle that we call Creating Moves to Opportunity, that was basically designed to help families move to higher opportunity areas if they wanted to, using these housing vouchers, in what is essentially what I think of as a social support intervention. So you get the same voucher that you were getting before, but you get some assistance in using that voucher in the form of a counselor, connections to landlords, a little bit of financial assistance if you needed to pay a security deposit, something like that. So sort of a helping hand to navigate this complex housing search process with the same basic structure of the federal government housing voucher that you would otherwise have gotten. Set it up as a randomized trial with 1,000 families who came in to apply for housing vouchers in the Seattle-King County area, follow families over time, look at where they end up moving. So here's the result. In the control group, only 14% of families move to high opportunity places, the top third of the upward mobility distribution based on the Opportunity Atlas data. In the treatment group, with that relatively light treatment, that costs only about $2,500, about a 2% incremental cost on the program. That number jumps to 54%. Now, so there's a really substantial treatment effect, and just to drive home, the importance of this, we estimate based on our prior work that the kids who kind of got lucky and ended up in the treatment group, on average, are going to go on to earn about $200,000 more over their lifetimes than the kids who were in the control group. So this relatively modest intervention that tries to provide them social support really fundamentally changes things. Now, to show that this is not just like some one-off thing we did in Seattle as an academic demonstration, I think even in this current fairly polarized environment, this type of thing really has an impact on what is happening at a broader scale. So there was a bill passed after the Seattle demonstration authorizing about $80 million in funding to replicate what we did in Seattle in 9 other cities in the US. That's currently happening now. But I think more importantly, $80 million is of course trivial in the grand scheme of things. So, the more important potential impact here is this bill that's currently working its way through Congress, again with bipartisan support, called the Family Stability and Opportunity Vouchers Act, which it proposes to expand the housing voucher program by $5 billion per year. And importantly, I think, and I've just highlighted here, really makes use of the modern social science research in designing this policy, right? So you can see that they're talking about 500,000 more housing vouchers targeted at families with young kids. So why do that? Because of the dosage effect that I was talking about. With access to counseling and management services. That's coming from the Seattle study that shows that that's really central. Engaging new landlords in the voucher program because those connections prove to be really important, and so on. So just to show you, I think this could actually have impact on thousands of kids' lives going forward. So much more quickly, let me just briefly touch upon these last 2 areas and conclude. So I want to emphasize that the moving to opportunity approach that I just talked about, we don't see that as the only area for intervention. Obviously, that's not the only thing that you can do to have an impact on scale. It's also important to think about place-based investments. And here, the key thing that I would emphasize is traditionally place-based policy in America has meant things like tax credits for firms to locate in particular areas. My sense is that basically doesn't work. What you really need is place-based investments that are focused on human capital development. And so what does that look like? It could, for example, look like job training programs that are targeted at helping people in a particular area get jobs. So what do I mean, as a very concrete example? When we put out some of our studies showing that Charlotte, North Carolina ranked 50th out of the 50 largest American cities in terms of rates of upward mobility, there was an interesting response. The local newspaper had an article about that saying how it's a wake-up call for Charlotte. And they set up a commission and a task force to figure out what they could do to improve economic mobility in their city. And as part of that, Bank of America ended up making a commitment to hire 1,000 kids, 1,000 people from disadvantaged backgrounds who grew up in Charlotte itself for their positions, recognizing that even though they were a thriving firm, they weren't actually helping people in Charlotte, as I showed you in those early slides. And so what they did is teamed up with a group called Year Up, which is a very rapidly growing sectoral job training program that provides social support services, mentoring, networks, in addition to a set of technical skills in a field like IT or whatever. And it turns out, if you look at randomized trials, we're working with Year Up to evaluate the impacts of their program. That can be incredibly successful in putting people in a different track. And so I think this Bank of America example illustrates how you can make place-based interventions that can really make a difference. So very quickly, lastly, on higher education, especially given this audience of academics, I just want to touch on how you can do very similar analyses of our own institutions. So similar to how we put out data for every neighborhood in America on rates of economic mobility, we've also publicly released data on rates of economic mobility for every college in America. And you can access these data through a nice tool that the New York Times has built. So I just want to quickly summarize what you find there. So here what we're doing is in the light gray dots, which I apologize might be a little bit hard to see, each dot here represents a different college in America. And for colleges, there are 2 dimensions that really matter for upward mobility. The one is, on the vertical axis, is how well kids from low-income families do when they attend a given college. So among students in the bottom 20% of the income distribution, what fraction reach the top 20%? And so if you look at elite private colleges in America, like Princeton, Stanford, Harvard, Cornell, et cetera, they look terrific on that dimension. Low-income kids who get the opportunity to attend those colleges do extremely well. But that's not the only thing that matters for a college's contribution to economic mobility. Obviously, what also matters is how many low-income kids you actually have on campus to begin with. And on that dimension, those colleges look pretty bad, right? So Harvard, for example, only 3% of kids or so come from the bottom 20% of the income distribution. Harvard has more kids from the top 1%, that's families making more than $650,000 a year, than from the entire bottom half of the income distribution, according to the tax data. So Harvard, despite being, producing pretty good outcomes, it cannot be a big contributor to economic mobility because, Harvard basically caters to the rich. So, why is that the case? So one possibility is that it's about all the upstream factors that I've been discussing in this talk, the different neighborhoods in which low-income kids grow up, the weaker schools that they go to, et cetera, that might limit opportunities to attend these, highly selective colleges. But my sense is that's not the only thing that's going on, and so I'll end with this slide here. If you look at attendance rates at Ivy Plus colleges, so the Ivy League plus MIT, Stanford, Duke, and Chicago. So plot the fraction of kids who attend an Ivy Plus college versus parental income, but do that conditional on SAT scores. So in our most recent work, we've linked the SAT and ACT scores for everyone in America to the tax data, to the education data that tells us where everybody's going to college. And so you can draw these plots here, which show you for kids with a given level of SAT scores, like take the green line, all kids who have a 1500 on the SAT, plot their probability of attending a place like Harvard, and you see a striking shape where there's a dip in the middle class and then it shoots up at the very top of the income distribution. So this type of phenomenon, while it's not definitive, and I want to be careful what I say here because not all of this is public yet, but this effectively looks a bit like you have affirmative action for the rich, right, in terms of who's attending these colleges. And my sense is that will be revisited in the context of other discussions about affirmative action in the coming years. So let me wrap up with that and just try to, I've shown a lot of different data, a lot of different specific things, but I hope you'll take away three things. One, I think local childhood environment really shapes trajectories in our country and in the world more generally. Second, I think most recent work suggests that sociological forces are really central in shaping economic inequality. And finally, as I hope I've shown here, modern observational data can help us understand how these things work and target interventions to improve things going forward. So I'll stop there. Thank you.